What I'm going to do in this class is use the lessons of history to apply to your daily life. That's what I love about history. It can really give you perspective, solace, and give you hope. I will use examples from the 4 presidents I know the best: Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson. Each one of these presidents was a leader during a time of great crisis. We can learn from their failures and their ability to acknowledge those failures and learn from their mistakes. I'd love to just transport them into you. Think of what you learn from parents, from people who have experience. You're learning from generations that lived before us. It makes you feel you're part of a continuum. You're not just here alone. So it makes you a deeper person and maybe even gives you that great thing called wisdom. I think about Abraham Lincoln, and he scoured the countryside for books, and he read everything he could lay his hands on. He understood that he was a work in progress. Nobody's going to be perfect. The most important thing for a leader to develop is the ability to grow. All of us in our lives are going to suffer difficult times, and the question is, can you get through it? Can you grow through it? Can you learn from it? I'm Doris Kearns Goodwin, and this is my MasterClass.
Hello, good evening, good night, good morning, depending on where you are, and welcome to a very special edition of MasterClass Live, the voting edition. For those of you who are new to the platform, MasterClass is a place where you can learn from the world's greatest minds about things as varied as writing a book or making a first-class meal, growing your own food, which a lot of us are doing right now, am I right? Or becoming a better negotiator. MasterClass Live is a way for you to connect directly with instructors and dive into the topics that go beyond the course, which is what we're about to do in this special voting edition. Now, in just a minute, I'm going to welcome world-renowned presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. But before we get there and get her virtual historical hug and context about how the past informs the present, there are a few other things I want to let you know about. We have a chat. We want you to use the chat to suggest topics or questions, and we may run out of time, but we're going to try very hard. And especially in the second half of our program, that's where your participation really makes a difference. We're going to have a roundtable with a historian, writer, and speaker, Tyree Pates, as well as Tappan Vickery from headcount.org. I know there's a lot of confusion out there about how voting is supposed to work. We have a lot of new procedures going on right now. So those two will join me to help us all understand how we can make sure our vote is counted. And at the very end of the show, we're going to give you a special opportunity to join a Friday event, a Text Out the Vote event, where you and fellow MasterClass community members, MasterClassers? I just made that up, where 50 of you will be able to do some live vote texting with each other, with music, with head count, and with special guests dropping by. I should also let you know who I am before we get this going. My name is Baratunde Thurston. I'm a writer, I'm an activist, I'm a comedian. I'm someone who cares deeply about the state of the world, enough to do more than just talk about it, though tonight my job is to talk, and I am coming to you live from Los Angeles, California, in the shed in my backyard in the neighborhood of Highland Park. We're all doing things that we weren't expecting to do when 2020 started. It's a really hard time for so many of us, and our nation's on a precipice. We've got someone joining to help us look at that precipice and hopefully pull back from it. She is so well equipped. She is a Pulitzer Prize winning author. She's the instructor of one of MasterClass's most popular courses on presidential history and leadership. Her name is Doris Kearns Goodwin, and she joins us right now. Doris, welcome to MasterClass Live Special Voting Edition. It's a special treat for me to be here with you. My full name is Baratunde Thurston. That makes me BRT. You are Doris Kearns Goodwin. That makes you DKG. So this is the day that BRT got to meet DKG. Welcome to the show.
It's a glorious day, and I'm really glad to be with you in this time of anxiety and fear, and as you say, a really tough time in our history. And if I could just start by saying that I think the most important lesson that history provides is that we've been through really tough times before and somehow emerged from them even stronger than when we began. I mean, just imagine being back in the revolution in the early days when it wasn't at all clear that that revolution would be won, but it was, and we became a nation. Or imagine what it was like in the early days of the Civil War. 600,000 people would die, a nation split in two, and yet that war was won as well, and the Union was restored, and the emancipation was intact. Or imagine what it was like in the early days of the Great Depression when it took the New Deal to carry us through until the mobilization for the war began, or the early days of World War II when it was not at all clear that that war would be won. And the difference is that those people living then, just like us now, had the fear and anxiety because they didn't know the end of the story. We know the end of those stories. So that's what makes it so hard for us now. But I think history provides perspective. It gives us lessons and it provides hope. And that's why I've loved it ever since I've been a little girl.
That you've given me a little more hope than I was expecting. And I like the idea that we know how the story ends, especially when I do not feel like I know how this particular story ends. I want to re-enter that Wayback Machine with you and go back to the beginning, to the founding of this nation, because I've grown up hearing that the United States of America is the world's oldest democracy. And yet in the very beginning, very few people who are today considered Americans could participate in that America. When it comes to voting in the early days of this country, what does the Constitution have to say about that in the beginning?
First, I'd love to comment on your Wayback Machine. I call it time traveling, but I think I may call myself somebody who now goes on a Wayback Machine from here on. But you know, it's interesting, as you say, I mean, the Constitution did provide the right for the people to vote for the House of Representatives. And that was considered a radical thing at a time when most governments were run by kings and queens and czars and dictators. But on the other hand, the question was, who are the people? And there, the framers were not able to come to any kind of national agreement. There was some, like good old Ben Franklin, who wanted the people to be the common people. After all, they had participated in the American Revolution. But most of the other framers thought that they should be property owners. There was somehow this notion that only people who owned property would have enough knowledge and information to be able to vote correctly. So since they couldn't come to a conclusion, they went to the states and left it up to them to decide who the people were that could vote. Most of those states made property a requirement for people to vote. And so it really wasn't until the mid 1800s that finally people who didn't own property went to the people who owned property and were allowed to vote. So you're right, it wasn't an easy notion at the beginning. And at the same time, then you don't find that same trust in the people on the part of the framers when they create the Electoral College. Supposedly the electors are these amazing people who own property and they somehow have knowledge, especially. And then clearly they're trying to balance the small states and the large states, so these compromises are made. But it shows that we had a long way to go in order to really broaden that definition of who the people were that were able to vote in this presumed democracy that we were creating.
Presumed democracy. I like the honesty of that phrasing. When I think about military service, I think about the ultimate sacrifice that people make to put their bodies on the line for the country. And we've been raised to respect that greatly and make sure that at minimum, the people who fight our wars get covered, get the respect of citizenship, get their access to their rights. But that wasn't the case with the Civil War. And I heard that Lincoln tried to extend voting rights to former combatants who were enslaved. That didn't happen. What's the story with that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, what happens is several nights before his assassination, Lincoln came out on the balcony. That's what he used to do sometimes when crowds would gather outside the White House. And this night there were thousands of people because they were coming to celebrate Lee's surrender at Appomattox. And he said for the first time publicly what he had already talked about privately, that he thought that the Black Americans who had fought in the war or were literate should be given the right to vote. Now, in that crowd that night was John Wilkes Booth, his future assassin. And he turned to his friend and he said, "That means Black citizenship." And he asked the friend to go up and shoot Lincoln right there. The friend refused, but then he said, "Well, by God, I'll put him through. This is the last speech he will ever make." And that was true. Sadly, it was the last speech he would ever make. So right there, he was going to be fighting for that right. And again, it took another period of time for that finally to work itself out. It's a slow progress, our democracy, but it does move forward.
That it's so to me it's strange to hear that it moves forward, but the story you just told sounds so familiar, so present, so current. It sounds like today with some of the radicalization that we see happening online and at rallies, to be very clear about it. And it sounds like some of the things that have happened well since Lincoln's time in the history of this country. But when it comes to one of those first formal steps, that 15th Amendment, which gave at least Black men the access to the ballot, clearly there were objections enough to inspire the murder of a president. What other objections were there specifically to that amendment, and how do we get through it?
Oh, you can well imagine there were objections in the North as well as in the South. There's a senator from Delaware who said it was an absolute exercise of tyranny. Interestingly, there were objections from some women who had been part of the abolitionist movement, and they felt that their friends, the abolitionists, had not included them because the amendment simply denied any kind of preventing of voting for race or previous condition of servitude, and they wanted gender included in there. But finally, it passes the Congress, and finally it gets ratified. And then for a period of time, Blacks are voting in large numbers. They're able to serve in statewide jobs, and they go to the Congress and the Senate. And then what happens is the South begins the backlash. We see so many regressions in our history, and the Jim Crow period sets in, and they're able to, in the voting areas, put forth all manner of devices that prevent Blacks from registering. Some of the same devices that we see coming back again today, but difficulties with registration, forcing tests, forcing moral character tests and literacy tests. And in a certain sense, the content of the 15th Amendment got repealed.
So it's not I want to believe, and I know it's not true, but I still hold on to this romantic notion that, like an investor's, pitch deck, America goes up and to the right constantly. You zoom out on that stock market picture and things just get better. Progress just happens and we're always moving forward, but clearly we're not. We're in a pendulum, and maybe history always is that way, where we swing forward and then we swing back. And the swinging forward and backward around women's rights in this country and women's suffrage and access to voting is one which does not get taught very often. I say, as a allegedly educated person myself, I would love the DKG treatment on how women's suffrage began and take us through some of those steps.
And you're so right that it's not taught well. I mean, I really didn't know the details that I've learned just on the 100th anniversary, which is incredibly exciting, what happened in women's suffrage. So it does begin in Seneca Falls in 1848, when women and a couple men get together and they draw up a declaration of sentiments modeled on the Declaration of Independence. And it included a whole range of women's rights, not just voting, property rights, the right to divorce, even dress code reform. But eventually, the landmark part of that Declaration of Rights was the right to vote. So at the beginning, it got a lot of women to support them, but it also produced a lot of mockery. There were some women who thought it was wrong that they should be spending time with their family and not gathering information and learning how to vote. And a lot of men thought the same thing. And there was a sense of cartoons that would come out. Oh my God, if women are spending time learning how to vote and learning what's going on in politics, then the lords will have to wash the dishes. They'll have to handle the broom. They'll have to darn the socks. What a terrible thought. But eventually they started organizing and speaking and writing and gaining some power. And it took time and was a very slow process.
Are there particular pivotal moments that you hold on to that made the difference in how that pendulum ultimately swung?
Yes, looking back, you can't always see it at the time, but looking back, I see really three pivotal moments. In 1913, the suffrage movement organized this incredible parade in Washington, and they had a great sense of timing. They did it the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Wilson was an opponent of women's suffrage. 8,000 women were at the parade. It was a splendid affair. They had bands and floats, and it was all really going successfully. And then the men came. The men had been there, of course, for the inauguration. You see pictures of them coming in with their derby hats on, and they started pushing. It's hard to imagine. They started pushing the women. Some were beaten. 100 of them had to be hospitalized. But what happened is that kind of activity on the part of the men really did issue an affront to the national consciousness. There is a fundamental sense of fairness, I believe, in the people of this country, and they saw that as completely unfair. And as a result, there was an aroused sentiment, public sentiment for the woman's cause. And Lincoln once said, public sentiment is everything. With it, anything can be accomplished. Without it, nothing can be accomplished. So consciousness was raised. So that was really the first pivotal moment. And then the following year, more militant action took place. They decided to picket the White House because of Wilson's opposition to suffrage. And day after day, they're out there. And at first, he would wave as he went by, but then he didn't count on their determination to stay there. And they stayed and stayed. And finally, they got arrested for obstructing traffic. They were thrown in jail. And once they were in jail, they went on a hunger strike, and they were force-fed. And those pictures then made it into the newspapers. And the sense, again, of unfairness of what had happened, it aroused more public consciousness. And then congressional hearings even followed from that. So that was the second pivotal moment. But the third one happened to be that we were in war, finally, and women were very active in the war. They were serving in manufacturing. They were serving in the agricultural area. There were even hello girls on the front over in Europe. And Wilson finally was shamed into realizing that if they were really with us in the war, that he had to be with them in the amendment. So he went to a session of Congress and gave a speech declaring if there are partners in the war, we need to be their partners in rights. So it finally passed the Congress, and then it goes for ratification in the country. And finally, the key moment is when Tennessee is going to ratify. And there's a young legislator who's 24 years old, and his constituents are against the suffrage amendment. But he gets a letter that morning, good old mom, from good old mom, saying, I hope you'll be a good boy and vote for the amendment. He does, and it turns the tide, and Tennessee ratifies, and it becomes the 19th Amendment. After so many years, there were only 2 women who were still alive who had been at Seneca Falls. So it was a long, slow progress, but finally, and I'm so glad we've really made it come alive again this year with documentaries and people talking, and that's a really good thing to do, to bring it back to life for us.
Yeah, and for me, it brings up the image, honestly, of the war movies that we get fed a lot of, especially the World War II movies, where it's like, how many movies does Tom Hanks? Love you, guy, love you. We had a lot of Tom Hanks World War II movies. Where's the Hello Girls movie? You know, where's the movie of the women who served and fought on a different front here at home and finally got a piece of the rights that half our citizens are due? So I appreciate that timeline. I also find something eerie and not necessarily satisfying or positive in the 1913 violence that you referenced outside the White House. And here we are in 2020 with violence outside the White House. We had a few years ago, Heather Heyer, a woman killed in Charlottesville, Virginia, at a public and peaceful demonstration by someone who was so filled with hate against the idea of expanding rights in this country and all lives actually mattering, as opposed to the rhetoric we often hear. So I just, the similarity across time is a source of hope, but also not entirely so. It's a little too close to home at times too. How do you seem to have an optimistic disposition about this whole thing, that it ultimately turns out for the best. But when you think about 1913 and you think about 2020 and the years in between and the similarities, how do you push yourself to that place of hope? Or do you? Or do you sometimes not? You just sit in the despair of it and the sadness of the similarity?
No, I really do think that that's where history comes in, because even though there are backlashes, moments of regression, moments when we really forget the ideals that we were founded on, there are moments when we move forward. I mean, I find enormous hope in the civil rights struggle of the 1960s. I almost think that's the template for the future. when you think about the nonviolence of the civil rights marchers, what they endured to get the Civil Rights Act and segregation in the South through in 1964, and then especially at Selma, Alabama, when we luckily again we celebrated this at the time of John Lewis's death to bring people back to what was that situation like. Here are peaceful protesters walking from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, and they're met with the Alabama state troopers who come in and brutalize them, pushing them to the floor, beating them to the point where John Lewis himself had to go to the hospital. But the positive thing about that was that it was seen on television screens all across the nation, and it aroused the consciousness of the people. Public sentiment was shifted. And the thing that happened there, which is what always has to happen, it's not just the aroused consciousness, it's that there has to be someone in the levers of power who can translate that demand for a vote into reality. And there was, in the highest seat of power in the United States, President Lyndon Johnson. And what he did was decide right then and there to go to a joint session of Congress and argue for the right to vote. And the speech he gave was considered one of the great speeches in the 20th century canon of speeches. He started off, "I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. Every now and then history and fate meet at a certain time in a certain place. So it was in Lexington and Concord, so it was at Appomattox, so it was in Selma, Alabama, and today we might say, and so it was in Minneapolis, Minnesota." And then he went on to say, this is not a Negro problem, not a white problem, not a Northern problem, not a Southern problem. It is an American problem, and we are met here tonight to meet that problem. And he argued, which is what we need to understand today, that if we face this problem of bigotry and injustice, we as Americans will be better off. And then he finally said, but we'll still have a long way to go after voting rights. But if we come together, then he paused and he said, we shall overcome, which means that the president is taking up the banner of the civil rights movement. That's when there's the linkage between the outside movement and the inside power. And weeks later, the Voting Rights Act passed. And the most amazing thing for me, I was a graduate student at Harvard. That's how old I was listening to that speech. And we were just overwhelmed by it. I'd been active in the civil rights. I'd been in the Civil Rights March in 1963, that again, saying how old I am. And it was so exciting to hear that speech. And little could I have imagined that 2 years later, I would end up working for the president who delivered it, President Johnson. But even more unimaginably, I would end up marrying Richard Goodwin, the man who crafted the words of that speech. So that whole part of that story has a very personal impact for me. And the more important thing is that weeks later, the Voting Rights Act passed. And for a time, all those devices that they were using to prevent the rights to vote, they were prosecuted and they were made illegal, and voting did expand greatly for a period of time.
It is a joy to be having this conversation with you, because I'm also realizing a couple of things. The violent backlash to expansion of humanity and rights, it happens, and it will probably happen again in this country's future. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and yet emancipation still happened. John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and yet the Civil Rights Act and voting rights still happened. There is not an inevitability to it, but I do think that there's this dance that happens with the forces of regression and the forces of progress, and they tug at one another. And we are in a space where some of that progress has won, and some of that has been maintained, and yet the forces of regression still show up, even when we think it's well and good. It's called the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but here we are in 2020, and a lot of the behaviors that it was supposed to prevent are now allowed again because of the rolling back of that act a few years ago in the Shelby versus Holder decision. So we're seeing attacks on the voting process again. We're seeing a state like Florida impose what to me looks like a practical poll tax by requiring that the former felons who had their rights restored in a 65% overwhelming ballot initiative result, they attached some strings to that term and said, well, you got to pay off all these fines first. And you've got folks like the governor of Texas, as another example, making just one drop box per county. Now, Texas is a huge country, and every county is like its own state in some places. So that feels farcical to me. I don't know what the legitimate argument for that is, but it could be argued. The practical application is it's harder for people to vote, and it's harder for certain people to vote, the same people who are supposed to be protected by that act. So how do you see the attacks on the things that we consider to be progress, and those who say we don't need those anymore, and yet we get rid of them and we start to backslide?
Oh my God, there's no question that we have to be ever vigilant about these attacks. And the people who are suppressing the votes by voter intimidation or creating artificial boxes that don't work or exercising limits that shouldn't be there should be prosecuted. There's just no question about it. The right to vote is the fundamental right in a democracy. And I think we just gotta have to figure out now all manner of ways that we can get to vote in this election. You know, the idea that there's some problem with mail-in voting, which is now being communicated to people, is absurd. I mean, we've been voting in states by mail for some period of time, and there's no evidence of fraud. So they've got to figure out, you either vote by mail or you vote early or you go in person and wait on long lines. But to exercise that right of vote it's more important now perhaps than ever before, because it is in a time when there's a collective effort to make it less. Voting should be a national holiday. It could even be a national week. I mean, it is, as Lyndon Johnson said, voting is the basic right in America when he was signing the Voting Rights Act. He said that it is indispensable. Without it, none of the other rights would be there. And it's the way you exercise control over your own destiny. So our governments should be choosing ways to make us all get to vote rather than trying to suppress that vote. And it's an experiment, this democracy, and it's in our hands to make sure there should be massive turnout in this election. And if there's massive turnout, then the kinds of things that are being done to try and suppress the vote will be suppressed themselves. That's my hope.
I hope for the same thing. And I think of higher turnout as meaning higher legitimacy. You know, if we're members of a representative democracy and we have this ability to choose our representatives, then the more of us who participate in that choosing, the more legitimate those representatives are. And so it kind of increases the fidelity. It's like you have democracy in standard definition, and you got your HD democracy. I want 4K. I want 6K democracy. All right. I want everybody adding a pixel of people power to that vote. And speaking of which, you reminded me, I recently got to interview Maria Teresa Kumar of Voto Latino for my podcast, How to Citizen with Baratunde. And she said something I never expected someone in the nonprofit space to admit. But she said the idea that you need a third-party organization to help people register to vote should be laughable in a democracy. It should be so easy. It should kind of come baked in. It should be the default setting of our democracy. And so we don't have that. You've said in a number of different venues that we ignore history at our peril. What do you mean by that? Can you expand on that?
Well, I think what that means is that we learn from our parents and our grandparents. So we must learn as well from the generations who went before us, from the times when they didn't meet the challenges that they should have met, and from the triumphs that they experienced. If we don't remember, and this is the theme, I think, of what we're talking about tonight, which I think is so important, if we don't remember those periods of progress, then we're just going to feel paralyzed as to where we are right now. I mean, there's a huge window of opportunity that is opened with the protest movement during this pandemic. In the middle of a pandemic, that protest movement has shown enormous strengths. Obviously, there have been attacks on it and there's difficulties with it, but it's a very important thing for the Black Lives Movement to have again changed the consciousness of the American people. And now it's an important time again for levers of power to be found to exercise and figure out how to get that content into reality. You know, there's a story I'd love to tell you, which is that in 1965, as the Voting Rights Act was going through, Lyndon Johnson turned to my husband, Richard Goodwin. He said, but that's not the whole hog. That's the way he would talk. You know, civil rights is important, voting rights is important, but the whole hog, and he was talking exactly about what the Black Lives Movement is talking about today, are the structural inequities in this society caused by racism. And then he talked about the fact that everybody's born with a range of abilities. In the speech that my husband worked for him on at the Howard University commencement, everyone's born with the same range of ability, but those abilities are either stunted or stretched by the family you grow up in, the neighborhood you grow up in, the school you go to, the opportunities or the denied opportunities they're given. You can't take a person to a starting line who is hobbled by chains and expect him to go forth with the same degree of possibility. And Martin Luther King sent a telegram saying no president articulated the depth and dimensions of the problems to get racial justice more eloquently. And the incredibly sad thing is he gave that speech in June of '65. A month later is when the war in Vietnam was escalated. And then the war took over. And then you had later all sorts of fate intervening with Martin Luther King dead and Robert Kennedy dead, backlash, and Richard Nixon wins the election. And you get a very different future than that. But it just shows that those problems are going to take enormous resources to solve. It's much harder economic resources than it is to provide legal rights to vote or even a civil rights act ending segregation in the South. But it is the destiny that we have to have. When this country is prosperous for all, and it is a sense of shared prosperity, everybody's going to feel better when these injustices are dealt with. And the COVID pandemic has exposed them in a way that we should all feel a sense of shared responsibility for when we see how many people of color have been hurt by it so much greater than anybody else. So we're poised at one of those windows of opportunity now, and I just hope we can go through it.
Have you ever considered running for president yourself? You seem pretty equipped.
I think I'm equipped to study the guys from the past. They're my guys. I wake up with them in the morning. I think about them when I go to bed at night. I've learned a lot from them, but I think at this point in time, I'm just going to tell you all about them and tell my stories, and that'll be the way that I will contribute to history, hopefully.
You're doing a great job. I'm also just amazed by, at length, your ability to quote from your guys, as you refer to them. It's like we're watching another version of Hamilton, the DKG edition, where you got a little LBJ moment, you got a little MLK moment. It's the 3-syllable gang, and you're doing great with it.
Yeah. I don't mean to be disrespectful when I call them my guys. It's just that I've spent so many years with them. It took me 10 years to write Lincoln. It took me longer to write about World War II than the war took to be fought. Yeah. It took me longer to write about the Civil War than that war. So I feel like I know them. And the great thing is I do get to learn there's a certain family resemblance of leadership traits that they have, which I think are important for all of us to understand right now. I mean, they all had humility, which meant the ability to acknowledge errors and learn from their mistakes. They had empathy, which means understanding other people's points of view. They had resilience to get through their own trials of fire. And their ambition was not just for themselves, it was for something larger. So you learn from these things. You learn the kind of things you want citizens to have, not just leaders. These are human qualities.
I love that for so many reasons, and folks are about to find out. Like I mentioned earlier in my podcast, it's called How to Citizen with Baratunde. And we chose this title really intentionally because we wanted citizen to be interpreted as a verb, as some actions, rather than just as a legal status. And then we had to come up with, well, what does it mean to citizen? And so like any good new society, we came up with our own little constitution, our principles, our declarations. And we had 4 things, which sounded very similar to the words you just dropped from the guys, your guys who you greatly respect. And the first is that to citizen is to show up. It's to participate. It's this active thing. We have a responsibility to get in the game. The second is that it's about relationships and investing in our relationships with other people, that we are ultimately interconnected and none of us does any of this alone. Otherwise, why be in society at all? The third is to understand our power, and the power to vote is a big part of that. There are so many others too. The power to gather in protest, the power to rally, the power to spend money, the power to spread ideas, and how we contend over power in a society, in a democracy at least, that's politics. And that's not a dirty word. It's the natural state of human affairs. And lastly, the fourth principle, we do all this for the benefit of the many and not just the few. And so when I hear you talking about the lessons you've learned from the sort of familial relation of these presidents, the things they have in common, it makes me feel like we're on the right track, and that this is not something that's just for presidents, right? It's for all citizens, documented or not. We're all in this society. We're all residing in company together. And if we have some of those principles, the humility, the resilience, the building relationships, then we can do this. It's going to be hard, but we can do this.
There's no question. And we first have to believe that we have that power. We have to remember what I think maybe some of these last decades have taught people, that it doesn't make a difference to vote. And that's completely untrue. I mean, that is the power that we have. But I think you're right. There is an active nature to what it means to be a citizen. And I love your first one, taking responsibility, because these are things we need to do in our daily life. You take responsibility for decisions. You take responsibility for getting yourself to vote. You take responsibility for getting other people to vote. And then finally, as you say, that it's a verb. I love the idea that it's a verb. And yeah, I like your definition. I'm going to install it in my own Wayback Machine and figure it and look back on these other guys and see if they had it. But Teddy Roosevelt once said, a good politician is like a good neighbor, somebody whose word you can trust. Those kind of simple folksisms, they're what we know as human beings. And leaders are leaders because they understand human nature. Citizens are active citizens because they understand the need to be connected. It's that need to be connected that we really have to figure out today, because our world has become so individualized. And when you think of the kind of technology we have right now, that people can be sitting at home virtually and just being on their computer and not have that human connection because of the pandemic. I only hope that the pandemic has made us hunger even more for that human connection, rather than feeling satiated by the idea that you can Zoom in with somebody else, because we need it as a human race. And I think once the pandemic has come to an end, we're going to see those actual gatherings once again, and hopefully that's where power will develop.
We are running out of time, Doris. I want to get two more thoughts to you. One from the Wayback Machine, and briefly if possible, but I remember you sharing in some venue a story of Abraham Lincoln in the 50s with a very partisan media environment, seeing the challenge of the country as one of asking, can we even govern ourselves? Is it possible? It was a question of faith. And maybe he had it and I'm misinterpreting it, but I feel like I'm facing that question now, and it seems like it was resolved in a civil war back then, and I don't want to go through that part of history again. How are you seeing the polarization we're living in right now? How are you feeling about our ability to govern ourselves, and how much more pain do we have to go through before we get to the other side of it?
Teddy Roosevelt once said that the worry for him about democracy was a situation where people in different classes, different sections, different religions would start seeing each other as the other, rather than as common American citizens, that they would be so removed from one another that they wouldn't understand the kind of passions and prejudices and hopes that the other classes or sections were feeling. And that's in a situation I think that we're in today, and it's definitely exacerbated by the media. The media exacerbated in the 1850s. If you were in the 1850s, the only news you got was from your partisan newspapers. You'd only read a Whig newspaper or a Republican newspaper or a Democratic newspaper. If you read a Republican newspaper about a Lincoln-Douglas debate, you would hear that he had done so great that he was carried out on the shoulders of his supporters. If you read the Democratic newspaper of the same event, you'd hear that he'd been so terrible that he was embarrassed, he fell on the floor, and they had to drag him out. And that's where we are today with alternative universes that we see in the social media and in cable network. After the partisan newspapers declined, national newspapers came into being, and then national radio, and then there were 3 television networks. At least there was an agreement on facts, if not opinions. But I think, again, there's such a hunger for that kind of common experience that I believe there's going to be ways that we're going to figure it out so that the younger generation can do something where they feel that sense of common Americanism. And that's what's going to heal us and begin to take us in a different direction.
Woo! Well, that direction is where I want to leave it. I'm going to give you one more opportunity to jump in here. I want a picture from you, Doris, of the future. You've seen this country at its worst. You've seen it at its best. Paint me the Doris Kearns Goodwin picture from a future historical perspective. After this moment, where do we go? What's your vision of the American future history?
Well, my vision would be that young people, having gone through this pandemic together, if we can make a way for them to get together from different parts of the country through maybe a national service program, much more expanded than what we have now. Every application for Teacher Corps or AmeriCorps, City Year are oversubscribed. But what if we took kids from the city and they went to the country, or the country to the city, and they were doing service for America, so they felt a sense of a common mission, which is what people in the military feel. It's not a coincidence that in the 1960s and 50s and 70s, it was the greatest era of bipartisanship, because so many of the congressmen and senators had served in either World War II or the Korean War. So if we could have that moral equivalent of war, there's so many things that need to be done in this country for national service. My vision is that the younger generation coming through this pandemic together will feel that responsibility. First, they have to go to vote in this election, and they did vote in larger numbers in 2018 in the midterms, but even so, only a little more than half the people who were eligible voted. So if they can take that first big responsibility by developing the habit of voting, I've realized that I'm now of an older age, that I voted in nearly a third of our presidential elections. That's an incredible thought. And it's really scary. But the first one I can still remember. In the old days, you turn the curtain behind you and you feel that sense of power. If that younger generation, they have the rendezvous and destiny for us, if we can make it possible for them to have such an experience like that together across all these lines, and then get some time off or some credit or some tuition free for college to get to college so more people can get to college, then maybe that generation, it's the hope of the future. And we've seen a lot of people who've been putting themselves out, young nurses and essential workers during the pandemic. You've seen the people who've been delivering the food, and that is often put on the younger generation. So let's just see if that first thing they can take responsibility for is to vote in huge numbers in this election, and then they'll become the leaders of the future. We've had younger people before who the older people looked back on and said, oh, they'll never do it, they're too soft. But I have a feeling that there's something in this generation. They care about climate change, they care about a lot of the things of the future, and they're speaking up, and they're activists, and they have the tools. That's one thing technology can do, is to organize you more easily than it could be in the old days when we had to go knock on doors. So yes, there's no other hope than having the hope. If you don't have it, we'll never move forward. So I say, yes, we admit the regressions. Yes, we admit the backlashes. Yes, we admit the difficult times, but it's a great country. And the ideals, I think the ideals of the Declaration of Independence are kind of in our DNA, and they'll keep bringing us back to those ideals when we fall short, and then we'll move forward. It's like a relay race. Each generation gets us to move a little further. Some go backward, but we're going to keep going forward.
Doris Kearns Goodwin, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to let you leave the stage now, but it's just been such a pleasure, and you've reinvigorated some of my little hopey, tingly feelings that have been lying dormant there for a while. So really appreciate you. I know our audience does too.
Oh, I'm so glad to have done this with you. I can't wait to meet you in person. We will do that when we're on the other side of this.
Yes, we will. That's my vision for America's future. I get to hang out in person with TKG. Thank you again for joining. We'll escort peacefully and lovingly Doris off the stage, and I'm going to move forward to the next part of our evening. Ta-da! It's just me. And again, that was a loving Zoom escort. No Doris Kearns Goodwins were harmed in the removal of that webinar speaker from the Zoom instance that we're in right now. Everything's a Zoom thing right now. Even if you're on Facebook, you're still in Zoom because that's where I am. That was a pleasure. That was enlightening. That was just scratching the surface, I'm sure. But I took some solace in the repetition through history, not just of the defeats, but of the victories. And I'm hoping that we get a little more savvy each time this pendulum swings and we push it higher the next time around. I want to encourage you all to use the chat function to submit your questions about voting. It's a very confusing time, sometimes intentionally so. There's active misinformation from our own politicians, from certainly foreign actors who have an interest in the demise of the United States of America. So if you're confused about something, if you're trying to communicate with a relative or a coworker and they're sharing some misinfo with you, if you don't know how you're supposed to submit your mail-in ballot, or you just have broader questions about the voting process and this election, we have two people who are going to help answer those questions with me and for you and for all of us. So our next guest, let me set them up for success. We have two people who have been in the work, as they say, for some time. One is a historian, a writer, a professor, a community mobilizer. His name is Tyree Boyd Pates. And the other works as the director of voter engagement at headcount.org. I can't even believe we got her in because anyone who works in voting is super busy right now. That is Tappan Vickery. They're coming up next. Let's take a look at their fancy cards while we lovingly add them to the Zoom. And we're back, and there are three of us. We got a Tyree, who clearly has a better version of my hairstyle than I do myself. We have a Tappan, which I think she owns a bridge on the Hudson River in New York. What an amazing name, Tappan Vickery. I thought Baratunde Thurston was pretty cool. And I'm a Thurston. So we got the three T's gathered here today on MasterClass Live, special voting edition. Thank you both for being here. And I want to get into it and not spend people's time too much. You both saw the conversation that just happened. Tyree, you first. Any reflections on what you heard? Either things that stood out to you that just resonated, things that felt like they were missing? Any fact checking? You're also a historian. I mean, this is your big shot.
No, I thought that Doris did an amazing job giving a historical timeline of where our country is and what this moment means. And I think what I can add and offer is just the ways in which race plays a valuable role in the ways in which we understand citizenship and the roles it plays in voting altogether. And so I'm proud to be on the heels of Doris and having this conversation with you today.
Awesome. Tappan, any observations? Same questions to you.
Well, that was amazing. First of all, I feel so lucky to have watched it. But one thing that Doris didn't talk about is the 26th Amendment. So I just want to throw it out there in context because it has a lot to do with the work we do. That was in 1971, where 18, 19, and 20-year-olds were given the constitutionally protected right to vote. And I think the fact that that was the last group that received the constitutionally protected right to vote has really led to the fact that there's not a culture around youth engagement and has impacted the way that youth interact with voting. And that's part of the reason why we do the work that we do.
Okay, well, I want to talk about that work. And while we're here with you, Tappan, I'll start with you. I have my own questions, but we have a lot of people, hundreds, maybe thousands at this point, tuned in. So this is from Daniel, who asks, how do you encourage others to vote while remaining impartial?
You know, I believe in democracy, which means that people have the power. And what makes democracy strong is the fair exchange of ideas. If we unilaterally believe one thing or another, then we stop growing and we stop evolving. You talked about moving up, always trying to get better. And I do think it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, more than it should be in our history. But I believe fundamentally in people making their own choices. And I believe that hyperpartisanship is the greatest threat to our democracy. So nonprofit organizations like Headcount, you talked about Voto Latino, staying neutral and staying in the lane where we believe in people's power to make their own choices is the best thing we can deliver to our democracy right now.
Thank you. Tyree, I want to hit you with a different one.
Sure.
And I want to try to merge some things. This is a question from Kenrick, who asked how you would explain the importance of voting to young people, particularly those who feel a sense of hopelessness in society or skepticism. And I want to tack on to that. I hope you don't mind me riding on your question, Kenrick. But because we're in a moment of such activism, in the streets activism by young people who at the same time are skeptical of the voting system. And so you can be out in the streets all day, every day, and then say, my vote doesn't count. And that feels cognitively dissonant, but clearly they're mature. They get power to some degree. So how do you talk to young people about encouraging them to vote, and with that extra twist of they might be invested in part of the system, but not the other?
Right. Well, being a young person myself, I understand this historical malaise that young people tend to have, because oftentimes we have probably seen our vote mean one thing in the ballot box, but when we walk out of it and all the results come to fruition, it may not look like what we intended or voted for. And this kind of this disillusionment we have and disenchantment with that process shouldn't move us to just throw the baby with the bathwater, if I can use the term. Moreover, we should feel responsible, not only to the infrastructures that have been laid for us by our ancestors, but really the commitment that they've shared in making sure that our vote counts as our voice and lives matter, right? And so I think the best ways to understand it is saying that the truth is that protesting and voting go hand in hand. And in order to shake a hand, you need both in order to make sure that one and the other can come to agreement. And I think in this moment, as so many people are actually radicalized to move people power to political power, I think there is a real opportunity for us to meet the challenge head on. And I think as a young person, now is that moment more than ever, because they are trying to count us out.
Thank you for that. This next one is for Tappan, and this comes from Sophia, who wants to know what is making this election season so confusing.
Oh, wow. Well, 2 months ago, there were 156 active lawsuits changing election laws in the states. As you may know, the states run all of their own election laws. There's no federal government mandate for how elections run, which has led to disenfranchisement, but maybe good, depending on how you feel about the federal government right now. So through that, there's been a lot of controversy in the states because we realized we didn't have a pandemic-proof democracy. March hit in the middle of the primary season, and literally, I think on Thursday, we closed down. On Tuesday, the 17th, there were elections for the presidential primary, and people didn't know how to be safe. They were trying to drive by, they were trying to pick up ballots. The states did not have rules to handle this last minute rush to have people take their ballots home. And it felt like your choice was, do I expose myself to this pandemic and this deadly virus, or am I heard? And while we have learned a lot about COVID-19 and how to be safe citizens in this environment, if we all follow the rules, that question still looms. And there are people who are autoimmune compromised or have other reasons in their life where they don't feel comfortable going to be in public. And the states have been scrambling. And there was a moment in like late March, early April, where we could have come together as a country and really solved this problem. There is bipartisan and has always been bipartisan support for election reform around this nature. And we didn't do it. All of a sudden it became a hyper-partisan issue, and it has led to more confusion. On my state-by-state deadline sheet that I keep in my pocket, I now have to highlight everything that is pending legislation and litigation. Those two things are not stopping, and the election is in weeks.
Yeah.
So that's what makes it confusing, but it doesn't have to be confusing for you, because I will help you. You can reach out to me anytime. I think my email is tappanv@headcount.org. And if you're not clear about something in your state, I will definitely help you.
Oh, you're like a voting fairy godmother. That's an amazingly generous offer. And just, Sophia, so you don't feel alone, this is my sample ballot for Los Angeles County. It is like an exam book, how thick it is. And the instructions for mailing it back, not going to show you my address, but the instructions for mailing it back are not simple. And I think there's also, there's certain things in our society that we make easy because it serves someone for them to be easy. Like Jeff Bezos gets my money very easily. That one click, it just flies out my wallet. But then other parts of our society, we put hoops in front of ourselves. And I say we because ultimately it is our system. So we have to also fight to simplify it. Thank you, Tappan, for the answer. I have a question from Kelly. How do we motivate people from non-swing states like California to feel like their vote even matters? Tyree, why don't you take this one?
Well, I mean, it's funny. I'm in California, and we've been blue since blue's been blue. And as California has really an opportunity to meet this moment head on, you have to look at why the vote matters, right? I think the national vote usually can be decided by the overwhelming majority, but you have to look at the local, and your vote matters just as much as it does, if not more locally than it does at a national level, and they go hand in hand. And I think especially in states like California, the malaise cannot afford to hit us, because just as much as our vote counts for our president, so does it matter for our city council and our judges and our DA. And we need the right people in those offices in order to make sure that when our vote goes in, that everything else coexists on the other side of November. So that's my answer.
Thank you. I'm going to tack on to that answer too. In terms of motivation, I have found what's motivating for me is to think of this as a job interview. These people work for me. I literally pay their salaries, and they want to use my money to do something that should be good for me. So I'm the boss, actually. It sort of flips the power dynamic. They get to work for me. And so, oh, and the lower on the ballot I know those voting ratios go down the lower on the ballot. So that means my vote counts for more lower on the ballot. The deeper you dive into your ballot, the more of your own power you reclaim. And then this book is real. The issues that are in here, affordable housing, affirmative action, taxes, there's always something taxy going on in California. So the motivation is, I want to hire good people to work for me. I want them to work in my interest, and I want to claim as much of my power as possible. Plus, I don't want to be embarrassed by my friends who are going to shame me if I do all this talking and don't actually vote. That's kind of hypocritical. So for Tappan, you get the first crack. I want both of you on this, but Tappan first. Heidi and Colby, who are ages 9 and 7. So even when you add them up, they're still not in the voting age, but they want to know, how can children make their voices heard, and what can we do to take part in our democracy?
That is an amazing question, and thank you for sharing it, guys. I am a mom. I have a 10 and 6-year-old, so I think it's amazing that you're paying attention. You can talk to adults in your life. There are adults in your life that are not voters and don't realize that you're paying attention and that it matters to you. I have an amazing story, and I won't call out names. A friend of mine was a non-voter, and her 12-year-old niece in 2018 sat down with her, and she told her what it meant to her that her aunt didn't vote, and how it hurt her and what kind of future she wanted to have. And her aunt is a dedicated voter now. And I believe that that is the power of young people at this moment, because you are paying attention and your voices matter, and we're creating a future for all of you. So please don't be afraid to have those adult conversations and to ask questions and to learn about the process.
Beautiful. Tyree, what do you say to Cody and Heidi?
To Cody and Heidi, I say that history is your best friend. Dr. Martin Luther King always realized the power of youth and the power of youth engaged in activism. I always look at the children's crusade in Alabama, and then you look at how those children constantly use their bodies, whether it be against ferocious dogs or the plight of water hoses being sicked on them, to still be arrested and sent into jail, to overwhelm the jail system, and then to be sent out over and over again, because they knew that Dr. Martin Luther King understood that real rights, true rights, civil rights are intertwined with children and the ways in which we view them. And I always look at the responsibilities of children being able to shape this country, and how youth over and over, whether it be in grade school classes or in college classrooms, how they're able to speak truth to power and make sure that their vote is heard, especially at the ballot box. So yeah, don't lose hope, and you can actually change the world if you choose to.
You can, and you have. And I think, voting is so important, and also it is a part of the whole. It is one of the tools we have in terms of our power as people in a democracy. And if you want to look at a young person, at a child who's had a huge effect on our democracy today, alive right now, Greta Tunberg, our climate action hero. And she couldn't cast a single vote, and yet it's children in Europe. And I encourage your parents to share the story of the young people of Europe and how they got a Green New Deal in Europe before we got one in the US. It was because of children doing what Tappan suggested, getting their parents to vote and telling them how important it is. We're inheriting this planet. Y'all left it all messy, so clean up your room, mom and dad, because we're going to inherit that room. We have a different Heidi on the line with a question for Tyree. I'll go with you on this one. How do we encourage people in densely populated, low-income areas to accept offers of transport to the polls? Their vote matters so much to improve the infrastructure and services provided.
Oh, I mean, I think the best way is to build means of trust. I think their trepidation and apprehension of taking these rides to the voting poll is built in, and it's historical as well. And I think the best way to do that is to create COVID-safe icebreakers that really perhaps can align them with, rideshare services that can better facilitate those discussions where it doesn't have to be so top heavy. But all in all, I think the inner city and those who need those rideshare opportunities to get to the polls are really excited. And it's really about listening to what they need in the moment beyond just travel to make their voyage as comprehensive as possible.
Absolutely. And check those CDC guidelines. They're still pretty good as long as you're not on the indoor space too long.
Right.
Masked up, social distance, don't rub your eyes, which is never a good idea. It's never a good idea, like rub your eyes and your nose and your mouth. That's basic home training and hygiene. We shouldn't have needed a pandemic for like wash your hands. Tappan, one for you from Kathleen, who wants to know, if I make a mistake on my ballot and the initials change, does that invalidate my entire ballot?
If you make a mistake on your ballot, you should, if you're voting in person.
Oh, sorry. Let me clarify this. I read this the wrong way. If I make a mistake on my ballot and initial the change, does that invalidate my entire ballot?
It does not invalidate your entire ballot. It would be better for you to get a new ballot. Think about a Scantron machine. It's not going to read your initials. Somebody may eventually go back and double check it, but it would be much better for you to get a new ballot. And if you are voting by mail, you can go to your county or local election office and let them know that you have a spoiled ballot. That's what they call it. And you can get a new one. Or if you're at a polling site, you can just let them know and they will scan the ballot out and scan another one and give it to you.
Thank you for that. I want to know from Tyree. I've been hearing a lot of like, make your voting plan. Like literally Michelle Obama told me to do that. Not personally, though. When she looks into the camera, right. I know she's looking just at me.
Just at you.
So how do you think about like, what is a voting plan for you?
Oh man, a voting plan looks like a foolproof, non-negotiable, day-long event that is going to ensure that your ballot meets the box that it's supposed to. I know for me right now, I've just received my ballot and I'm going to make a weekend of it. And I'm going to spend as much time researching as many of these propositions that are expected to pass, but also looking at the ways in which my local library or other entities have set up ballot boxes nearby, and then making sure that I mark it in my calendar 2 weeks in advance before November the 3rd, that I am dropping it off and knowing that it's counted. And I think incentivizing those things where, again, being COVID safe, even if you need a partner and you're wearing a mask, you guys can do that together, and making sure that your Google calendars are synced up so that you guys are delivering it as it should be to respective place.
Thank you for that. And I think, on the mistakes question that we threw to Tappan, I've been thinking about this as an open book exam this election. Try to get the ballot early. I don't want to be spending a lot of time, if I'm voting in person, in the booth. That's part of the plan. Know the answers before you get the test. What other kind of test do you get to know the answers before you take it?
Right.
Elections. If you have a sample ballot where you fill all that out first, then you're just copying over the stuff you are certain of. And it's just fewer mistakes, more democracy. I want to go to Tappan with, because we're coming close to the close of our time with both of you. But Tappan, you got some deadlines that you want to share with us, that I want you to share with us. Can you just do your head count thing? What do we need to know? What's in the calendar according to Tappan V?
Well, there's still places in the country where you can register to vote. There's several states that are having deadlines today. So I encourage you, if you're not registered, to register. If you have not started the vote by mail process and you elect to vote by mail during this election, you should start it today, or maybe decide to vote in person instead, because there's just not enough time for you to necessarily get your ballot requested and get it sent to you and then get it back in. We're suggesting that anyone who has a ballot in their hand as of the 20th of this month makes a plan to deliver it in person. Now, you cannot do that in the state of Tennessee. And if you have a certain ballot in the state of Oklahoma, you cannot deliver it in person. Not everybody, it depends on which one you have. But for everybody, and I have to put those disclaimers in because somebody from Tennessee will call me later if I don't. But I encourage you to please consider delivering your ballot in person after the 20th if you still have it in your hand. That's totally fine. You can take it to your county or local elections office, a drop box in many locations, or sometimes early voting and polling sites, depending on your state. And all of that information is at headcount.org/makeyourvotecount. You can pick a drop down for your state. We are updating it in real time as all of this litigation and legislation is moving things around. And we're doing the best that we can within a 24-hour window to keep it up to date. And I also just really encourage you to make sure that you take your time with your ballot. As Baratunde mentioned, like, you can actually plan this out, but if you are voting by mail, especially, if you mess up on the details, your ballot could be disqualified, and then your vote won't have a chance to count, including using the return envelopes. You've seen maybe the media, don't send your ballot naked. So don't send your ballot naked. Use all the return envelopes, and then also signing in the correct place, dating in the correct place, and adding postage if you need to.
You got that, everybody?
Sorry, that was more than you asked for.
but everything I needed. So tell us the URL for that website one more time, please.
Sure, it's www.headcount.org/makeyourvotecount.
Make your vote count on headcount.org. I want to give each of you an opportunity before we wrap. Tyree, then Tappan. Anything you want to add?
One thing I'd like to add is that history is the most powerful weapon you can wield, particularly in an election year. This should incentivize us to understand that what decisions we make in 2020 will have an impact on the next 8 years. And I really hope that we can use, whether it be President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, the Clinton administration, the Reagan administration, as foolproof steps as to how to engage with our futures. And I think that understanding the ways in which policy shapes Black and Brown communities should it actually catalyze us and radicalize us to come out in full droves in 2020. So that's what I'd say.
Thank you. I love the idea of radicalizing people to the polls. That's that's a nice mix there. Tappan, closing remarks from you.
I've got two, and I'm going to be super quick. The first is early voting is an awesome option to keep you out of a long line and to give you options to vote on your schedule. In some way, shape, or form, you can vote early in every state in this country. Sometimes you have to go to a county office. Sometimes you can go to multiple satellite locations. But figure it out when you're making your voting plan, and don't miss the opportunity to vote early on your schedule. And the second thing is, I just want to say headcount is possible because of the incredible support of our partners that we work alongside. And I want to shout out Virginia for the People, one of our great new partners that we're represented with here tonight. It comes from Pharrell Williams, Something in the Water Festival. And this is just a great example of an opportunity for us to get in front of a new audience through partnership and really bring together the arts and culture to help mobilize and educate young voters and voters everywhere. So thank you to all of our partners and to MasterClass.
Thank you to Tappan Vickery. Thank you to Tyree Boyd Pates. We have more coming up after a quick break. Hey, it's just me again. I kicked everybody else off the Zoom. I like Zoom to myself. Don't you have that sometimes? You have all these other people in your Zoom. You're like, come on, sometimes I just want to talk to me. This has been This has been real. This has been enlightening, overwhelming amounts of information, but not too much that I've lost it all. I'm so appreciative of the time that Doris Kearns Goodwin gave to all of us this evening. I'm appreciative of the time and the specific tactics that Tappan Vickery from Headcount and Tyree Boyd Pates offered in terms of the power of history and how we wield it, radicalize ourselves to the polls. If you've joined late and you have no idea who I am, I'm Baratunde. Have been all night, will be tomorrow, and evermore as long as I can control it. And I have a show that's similar on these topics called How to Citizen with Baratunde. I'd love for you to check it out. You can find me at baratunde.com. There's one more thing, and I promise one more thing, kind of like Columbo, showing my age at the end of those episodes. A special offer and a special opportunity for you in the MasterClass universe, the MasterClassiverse. Never going to say that again. There's an exciting opportunity to make a difference with this election by joining a MasterClass fan-exclusive Text Out the Vote event. It's a virtual party. You can think of it as a texting party, which sounds weird when I say it out loud, but it's actually going to be fun. It's this Friday, October the 16th. It's 5 p.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. And MasterClass is teaming up with headcount.org, providing music, providing our friends Tyree and Tappan who are going to drop by. And it's a chance for you to connect with each other and also to serve, to turn out the vote. We have 50 slots available to do this. So the sooner you sign up, the better. The link to register is up in the chat. I'm sure they'll put it up on one of those fancy cards that I don't get to see. Like, you get a whole version of this that I don't even get to see. I just see the camera, but you got graphics and people's faces. It's amazing. I have to use my mind. Anyway, it's been a pleasure. It's been an honor to host this. Thank you, MasterClass, to the live team. Y'all rock. Thank you, Zoom, because every day we got to thank Zoom like 10 times. It's literally holding our democracy together. Have a good night. Have a good day. And let's vote. It's our power. Let's claim it.